So in previous lectures, we went over how to use the curves adjustments as well as the levels adjustments in Photoshop. There are a couple instances where you might not have enough time to really customize your effects and you just want a quick fix as far as contrast or lighting. And so in those instances, you might want to just go to Image, Adjustment, and then there's Brightness and Contrast. And what this does, this is also an adjustment layer you can do, but this one's a little bit larger, has more contrast compared to the background. So what you want to do is on Brightness, if you bring that to the left, it just makes it a darker photo, right? If you go all the way to the left, negative 150, it's not completely black though. So it's not, totally underexposing it, for example. It's just adjusting the brightness of the overall photo. And then if you bring it to the right, it's going to make it a much brighter photo. In contrast, what that does after resetting brightness to 0, just to show what this does, if I go over to the right, it just makes the darkers darker and the lighters lighter. If you go to the left, it makes it more of a flat photo, and you can hit auto and it'll try to figure out what it should do. So it doesn't have as much control compared to, say, levels, where you can make the lighter lighter, the darker lighter darker, and darker lighter. It's going to just do two of those at once. So if we go to Image Adjustments, Brightness, Contrast, with contrast again, the darker is getting darker and the lighter is getting lighter at the same time, and then the opposite on the left. Now if you go to Image Adjustments, Exposure, if you think about in photography, if you have your shutter speed open for a long time, it's a longer exposure, right? The longer the film or the digital sensor is exposed to the light. So if you go to the right, it's simulating what it would look like with the longer shutter speed, for example, or a wide open aperture, kind of, in a way, without adjusting the depth of field, of course. But so if you go over to the right, eventually it just becomes all white. If you go all the way to the left, it's completely black. So if you just want a slightly darker photo or lighter photo, you can adjust the exposure there. Now if you go to offset, if you go all the way to the right, it's not affecting the highlights as much. It's mostly affecting the dark areas, the shadows, and the midtones. So if you go to the left, it's going to be completely black, except some of the highlighted areas are not. And go to the right, it's really bright around here, but again, the highlights don't change too much. It's just affecting the shadows and the midtone values. And then finally, gamma correction or midtone values, if you go to the left, it's just affecting the brightness, except the opposite. It's not going, it's not getting darker as we go to the left like it would with the exposure. It's getting brighter. And then if you go to the right, it gets darker. So there's a couple different ways to affect it. The defaults are 0, 0, and 1. And if you use these, setting the dark point, the gray point, and the white point, it's a little bit different than the levels eyedropper tools. It's not affecting all the color range. So what I mean by that is if you use this to set the black point in the exposure tool, and let's just say, let's find a dark area here, and you click it, see how it only affects the offset? So I click all around, it's only affecting the offset there. It's not trying to adjust the exposure or the gamma correction. Now I'm going to bring that back to 0. If I set the gray point, let me just guess here, it only affects, as you can see, the exposure. Now, if I go to, say, in the white point, click that, it's only affecting the exposure as well. So setting the gray point and the white point only affect the exposure, as you can see. But when we're setting the black point, it affects the offset. So I'm going to hit cancel, just go back, I'm going to reset that so we can look at this again one more time. So this is more effective in higher bit photos, say like 16-bit and 32-bit. With 8-bit, it can be kind of extreme when we go too far in one direction. We don't have as much dynamic range or the amount of light between complete black and complete white. So what you can do, if this is just making the changes too quickly, if it's just too drastic as you move that slider, what you can do is hold Control on the PC or Command on the Mac, and then you hover over the number, it turns into a scrubby slider, so you can actually click and drag, and it's very subtle. You'll see that slider is moving a lot more slowly. So you can do that for all three. Alright, so that's just a quick tip. Hold on to Control on the PC or Command on the Mac, hover over these numbers, and you can adjust these with a little bit more precision. So those are the quick photo fixes of adjusting brightness, contrast, and exposure. Again, some of them are not as versatile as curves and levels, but sometimes it might be all that you need as far as just brightening up a photo or adding a little bit more contrast. In the next lesson, we'll cover making photos pop a little bit more and adding a little bit more lightness and saturation in a photo.